The one-time pad provides perfect security. The theory is simple. Encrypt your message with a random sequence of numbers. Each sequence is used only once. Without the key, decryption is mathematically impossible. The Soviets used this system, NKVD-GRU, diplomatic traffic, all protected by one-time pads. The Americans seemed helpless, but the war changed everything. 1942. German armies stood at the gates of Moscow. Soviet cipher production fell into chaos. Some cipher pages were printed more than once. This was a fatal error. When the same cipher was used on two different messages, those messages became solvable against each other. Codebreakers began finding patterns. It took years. Each message was a separate puzzle, but slowly the pieces fell into place. The unbreakable code had been broken, and the Soviets had no idea. This is the story of the most secret intelligence program of the Cold War. How American cryptanalysts cracked Soviet communications, and how the secrets they uncovered remained hidden for 40 years. The program began in February 1943. At Arlington Hall, a former girls' school in Virginia, the United States Army's Signal Intelligence Service was reading enemy communications, German codes, Japanese ciphers. But Soviet traffic remained untouched. Jean Grabiel, a young analyst who had been a schoolteacher just months before, was assigned to examine encrypted Soviet diplomatic messages. It seemed like a hopeless task. The Soviet system was considered unbreakable. One-time pads, properly used, offered perfect theoretical security. Without the key pages, the messages were just random noise. Grabiel began sorting and cataloging the messages anyway. Perhaps there were patterns, perhaps there were weaknesses. At minimum, organizing the traffic might prove useful someday. The project was given various code names over the years: Jade, Bride, Drug, finally Venona. The name meant nothing. It was chosen precisely because it was meaningless and unmemorable. For the first 2 years, progress was minimal. The analysts accumulated messages, studied transmission patterns, and searched for any irregularity that might offer a foothold. Then, in 1944, a brilliant cryptanalyst named Richard Halleck made a discovery that changed everything. Halleck found something that should not have existed. In theory, every one-time pad page was unique. Each page was used once, then destroyed. No two messages should ever share the same key material. But Halleck noticed that some messages showed similarities that could only be explained by key reuse. Somehow, the Soviets had used the same cipher pages more than once. The reason was the war itself. In 1941 and 1942, the Soviet Union faced existential crisis. German forces advanced rapidly. Moscow was threatened. Industrial production was disrupted as factories were evacuated eastward. The NKVD cipher office could not produce enough one-time pad material to meet demand. In desperation, they made duplicate copies of some key pages. Different Soviet stations received identical cipher material. This was a catastrophic security breach. The Soviets knew it was dangerous, but they did it anyway, gambling that the Americans would never notice. They were wrong. When the same key encrypts two different messages, the two ciphertexts can be combined mathematically. The key cancels out, leaving a relationship between the two original messages. With enough analysis, both messages can be recovered. This was not easy. It required painstaking work, brilliant intuition, and years of effort. But it was possible. The door had cracked open. The first real breakthrough came in 1946. Meredith Gardner, a linguist and cryptanalyst of extraordinary ability, joined the Venona effort. He had taught himself German, Spanish, French, and Russian. He had worked on Japanese codes during the war. Now he turned his attention to the Soviet problem. Gardner began reconstructing fragments of the underlying code system. The Soviets used a two-layer encryption. First, the original text was converted into numerical groups using a codebook. Then, these numbers were encrypted using the one-time pad. Even with key reuse, breaking into the system required understanding both layers. Gardner had to work backward, deducing codebook values from the fragments of decrypted text. On December 20, 1946, Gardner made his first breakthrough. He recovered a partially readable message from 1944. It contained a list of names, scientists working on the Manhattan Project. The implications were staggering. The Soviets had penetrated America's most secret program. They had agents inside the atomic bomb project. Gardner continued his work with increasing urgency. More messages yielded to analysis, more names emerged, more secrets were exposed. By 1947, it was clear that the Soviet espionage network in America was far larger than anyone had imagined. The decrypts revealed a vast network. One message from 1944 described an agent codenamed Liberal. Liberal was recruiting sources within the Manhattan Project. Liberal had a wife named Ethel. They lived in New York. The FBI began investigating. Liberal was Julius Rosenberg, an electrical engineer with communist connections. His wife was Ethel Rosenberg. The Venona messages showed that Julius had recruited his brother-in-law, David Greenglass, who worked as a machinist at Los Alamos. Greenglass had provided drawings of the implosion lens used in the plutonium bomb. This was devastating intelligence. The heart of the atomic bomb's design had been transmitted to Moscow. But there was a problem. The FBI could not reveal how they knew. Using Venona in court would expose the entire program. The Soviets would learn that their codes had been broken. They would change their systems. Future intelligence would be lost. So the FBI built its case through other means. They pressured Greenglass to confess and testify against his sister and brother-in-law. They gathered circumstantial evidence. They never mentioned Venona. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested in 1950. They were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. They were executed in June 1953. To this day, the Rosenberg case remains controversial. Were they guilty? Venona suggests Julius certainly was. Ethel's role remains disputed. Did they deserve death? Opinions still differ, but the Venona dimension of the case remained secret for another 40 years. The Rosenbergs were not the only atomic spies. Klaus Fuchs was far more damaging. A German-born physicist who had fled the Nazis, Fuchs was working on the British atomic program when he was transferred to Los Alamos in 1944. Fuchs had access to the most sensitive aspects of bomb design. He understood the physics. He attended high-level meetings. He knew details that even the Rosenberg network could not provide, and he was a Soviet agent. Fuchs had been recruited in Britain in 1941. He transmitted atomic secrets throughout the war and continued after it ended. The information he provided may have saved the Soviets years in their bomb development. Venona messages confirmed Fuchs's espionage. But again, the evidence could not be used directly. British intelligence confronted Fuchs in 1950 based on other leads. He confessed. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Theodore Hall was another atomic spy identified through Venona. A brilliant young physicist, Hall was only 19 when he began passing secrets to the Soviets. He believed that American atomic monopoly was dangerous. Sharing the technology would create balance. Hall was never prosecuted. By the time investigators had enough evidence, Venona was too sensitive to expose. Hall eventually admitted his espionage in interviews decades later. He died in 1999, unpunished, the Venona. Decrypts ultimately identified at least 5 separate Soviet sources within the Manhattan Project. The atomic secret was no secret at all. The atomic spies were not the only revelations. Venona messages pointed to penetration throughout the American government. The State Department was particularly compromised. One of the most important cases was Alger Hiss. A high-ranking State Department official, Hiss had attended the Yalta Conference with President Roosevelt. He had helped establish the United Nations. He was a pillar of the establishment. In 1948, Whittaker Chambers, a former communist, publicly accused Hiss of being a Soviet spy. Hiss denied everything. He sued Chambers for libel. The case became a national sensation. Hiss was eventually convicted of perjury in 1950. He served 4 years in prison, but he maintained his innocence until his death in 1996. Venona provided evidence that Hiss could not deny. Messages from 1944 described an agent codenamed Alès who matched Hiss's position and activities. The identification is not absolutely certain, but most historians now believe Hiss was indeed a Soviet agent. The Hiss case was politically explosive. Conservatives saw it as proof that communist infiltration was real. Liberals saw it as a witch hunt. The debate raged for decades. When Venona was declassified in 1995, the evidence tilted strongly toward Hiss's guilt. The establishment figure who had shaped American foreign policy had been working for Moscow. Venona created an extraordinary dilemma. The program provided intelligence of immense value. It identified Soviet agents. It revealed espionage networks. It showed the scale of penetration into American institutions. But using this intelligence was almost impossible. Every prosecution risked exposure. Every action based on Venona could potentially tip off the Soviets. If Moscow learned their codes were broken, they would change everything. The flow of intelligence would stop. So the FBI and CIA operated in shadows. They used Venona to guide investigations, but found other evidence for prosecutions. They watched known agents without arresting them. They allowed some spies to escape justice to protect the larger secret. This created agonizing choices. Harry Dexter White was a senior Treasury Department official identified by Venona as a Soviet source. He had influenced American economic policy. He had shaped the Bretton Woods Agreement. He died of a heart attack in 1948, just after being publicly accused. He was never prosecuted. Lauchlin Currie was a White House economist under Roosevelt. Venona identified him as a Soviet contact. He moved to Colombia in 1950 and lived there until his death in 1993. Never charged, never tried. The list of identified agents who escaped justice is long. The secret was more important than punishment. Did the Soviets know their codes were broken? The answer is complicated. In 1945, a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Guzenko defected in Canada. He brought documents proving Soviet espionage. His defection caused panic in Moscow. More damaging was Kim Philby. Philby, the British MI6 officer who was secretly a Soviet agent, learned about Venona in 1949. He was assigned to liaise with American intelligence in Washington. He was briefed on the program. Philby immediately informed Moscow. The Soviets knew their wartime codes had been compromised, but they faced their own dilemma. If they suddenly changed their systems or recalled their agents, they would confirm that they knew. The Americans would realize there was a leak at the highest levels. So the Soviets played a careful game. They quietly warned some agents. They retired others. They improved their cipher discipline, but they did not panic openly. Some agents were not warned at all. Perhaps Moscow considered them expendable. Perhaps the communications channels were too compromised to risk contact. The Rosenbergs went to the electric chair without Moscow lifting a finger to save them. The dance of secrets continued. Both sides knew more than they admitted. Both sides pretended ignorance they did not possess. How extensive was Soviet espionage in America? Venona provided a partial answer. The program decrypted only a fraction of Soviet communications. Many messages were never broken. Many networks were never identified. But even the partial picture was alarming. The decrypts identified approximately 350 Americans who had clandestine relationships with Soviet intelligence. This included agents, sources, couriers, and contacts. They were everywhere. The State Department, the Treasury, the Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, the Manhattan Project, defense industries, scientific institutions, media organizations. Some were ideological communists who believed in the Soviet cause. Others were opportunists seeking money or adventure. Some were manipulated through personal relationships or blackmail. The scales suggested that American counterintelligence had been catastrophically inadequate during the war years. Security procedures had failed. Vetting had been superficial. The enemy had penetrated deeply. Venona could not capture everything. It covered only certain time periods when key reuse occurred. It decrypted only a percentage of the intercepted traffic. The true scale of Soviet espionage was certainly larger than what Venona revealed. The program offered a window into a hidden world. Through that window, the view was disturbing. Why was Venona kept secret for so long? The original reasons were operational. Revealing the program would tip off the Soviets. Even after they likely knew through Philby, confirming it publicly would force changes. There might still be value in the uncertainty, but operational security does not explain 4 decades of silence. Part of the reason was institutional. The National Security Agency, which inherited Venona from the Army, was itself a secret organization. Its very existence was classified until 1975. Revealing Venona would expose NSA capabilities. Part was political. The Venona revelations would reopen old wounds, the Hiss case, the Rosenberg execution, the McCarthy era. All would be revisited with new evidence. No one wanted that controversy. Part was legal. The decrypts had been used to guide investigations but never presented in court. Revealing them now would raise questions about past prosecutions. Had defendants been denied evidence? Were convictions tainted? So the silence continued. Venona became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. Analysts who worked on the program took their knowledge to their graves. Only in 1995, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, did the NSA and CIA finally declassify the Venona materials. The Cold War was over. The secrets no longer mattered in the same way, or so they thought. The release of Venona transformed historical understanding. Debates that had raged for decades were suddenly clarified. The Hiss case, the Rosenbergs, the extent of Soviet penetration. Venona provided evidence that had been missing from the public record. For conservatives, Venona was vindication. They had always claimed that communist infiltration was real. The evidence now proved them right. McCarthy may have been a demagogue, but his fundamental premise was correct. For liberals, Venona was more complicated. Many had defended Hiss and the Rosenbergs as victims of hysteria. The evidence now suggested otherwise. The question became not whether there were Soviet spies, but whether the response had been proportionate. For historians, Venona opened new avenues of research. The decrypts could be correlated with Soviet archives that had briefly opened after the collapse of communism. A fuller picture of Cold War espionage emerged. Venona also raised troubling questions about secrecy in democratic society. For 40 years, the public had debated cases without access to crucial evidence. Innocence and guilt had been argued in ignorance. The government had known the truth, but chosen to hide it. Was this necessary? Was it right? The answers depend on how one weighs security against transparency, operational needs against democratic accountability. The unbreakable code was broken. The secret was kept. And when it was finally revealed, history had to be rewritten. Venona remains one of the great intelligence achievements of the 20th century, and one of its great mysteries. The codebreakers did their work in silence. The truth emerged only when it no longer seemed to matter, but truth always matters, even 40 years late.